So we go forward, Gospel of Mark, chapter 15. In the last session, we have, in great depth, we have dwelled on the Jewish trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Here also in the opening session, it begins with a final, culmination of the session of the Sanhedrin. And then we have the entire session of today, Jesus standing before Pilate and how Pilate examines him. And we will see how back and forth Pilate tries to save Jesus as it appears to be, and what exactly is the whole power politics behind the things that are happening in this Roman trial. So here we go, the Roman trial of Jesus. I'll give you a just brief overview of chapter 15, what we are going to expect. This is a very lengthy, long chapter. So first we have the Sanhedrin trial, which is not a real trial because already the preliminary trial has taken place and looks like, and he was subjected to a lot of brutal treatment, humiliation, and finally the way, they were trying to see that desperately they are trying to find charges to bring against Jesus, and how the testimonies finally don't align, and then finally the chief priest steps in, asking the Christological question to Jesus, putting him they condemn him. When we begin chapter 15 here, the opening of chapter 15 is the Sanhedrin again meeting in the morning. So it appears to be a second session of the Sanhedrin. I will go in further detail when I share the slide. So we have the Sanhedrin trial, which is not actually the real trial. It is culmination of whatever has happened, a few hours ago. The detailed examination and hearings have already wound up through an illegal preliminary trial in the dead of night at the high priestly mansion, as we have seen. And the Sanhedrin, the true council, probably has been hastily convened just to give it a semblance of legality. So it is a hastily convened council, and probably the true council that made up all the rest of the members, 70 of them. And the whole thing was, it was very hastily summoned just in order to ratify the stand that they have already taken. Much before the trial really happened, they had already in their mind condemned Jesus, and by hook or by crook, they wanted to see that he was done to death. Then we have the hearing before Pilate. It moves on, the scene shifts on to the praetorium, that is the governor's palace before Pilate. Pilate is under tremendous political pressure from the local aristocrats to go ahead and convict Jesus. But Pilate looks for a way around it. He thinks, let the crowd decide about that. But that doesn't go the way he wants, because the crowds are influenced by Jesus' enemies, and so Pilate eventually hands over Jesus for crucifixion. We'll see. Then we see towards the end, Jesus is crucified on the cross, and then he utters his final words, though Mark does not give us all his final words, only some of it. Mark tells us that he cries out, but doesn't tell us what he cries out, except for the one thing that is consistent with Jesus' suffering. My God, why have you abandoned me? Okay. Then we hear of the women who followed him to the end, and then Joseph of Arimathea somehow shows up to give a proper burial. And probably he also must have been one of the leading men of the Sanhedrin, but must have been a very minority dissenting voice, just a few of them who really stood up for Jesus, but they are not named. So we have this chain. If you look, back and forth, we have this chain of Jesus being handed over. Judas hands Jesus over to the Sanhedrin. Then we see the Sanhedrin hands Jesus over to Pilate, and Pilate hands over Jesus to the will of the crowds, and eventually the soldiers who crucify. So everyone, we will see, is passing the buck, pushing the blame onto someone else. But in the end, everyone is responsible for what happens. Chapter 15 begins with this statement. As soon as it was morning, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, That means this gives an indication that maybe the entire Sanhedrin was not convened when the late night trial was happening. Maybe a few selected people who would, be able to take the side or the stand of the chief priest and their cronies, only they probably were there. But here the Sanhedrin, the full council, seems to have been assembled, and Mark does not give us any further details. Just in this one line, he tells us that they had the consultation, and from there, Jesus was handed over to Pilate. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priest accused him of many things. Okay, so from the priestly mansion, they have come now to the governor's palace, which probably was Herod's palace. Herod had built lots of palaces, okay, on the western side of the city. So probably this is the praetorium, the governor's palace, where Jesus has been brought before him. And Pilate is intensely looking at Jesus because this entire motley crowd that has assembled. It's very strange that these elite chief priests, they were the aristocracy. So they were the ones who would not easily mingle with the common people. They always considered themselves to be a little apart from everyone. So here, just because, they want to see that, Jesus is finally put to death, they have no hesitation in commingling with the rabble that has gathered over there, and probably might have been bribed also by them. And they are all, okay, pressing against Jesus, and Jesus is just facing Pilate, and they keep on making lots of accusations. The accusations keep flying, okay, and yet Jesus does not answer them at all. When Pilate questions Jesus the first time, "Are you the king of the Jews?" as they say, Jesus does answer him. He doesn't remain silent the first time Pilate poses him the question. And what does Jesus answer? He answers in a very strange way. "You say so." The first time he says this, like as if to say, "That's the way you put it," or like, in common parlance, you could say that. And that is exactly what they are saying. We need to remember that Jesus has been announcing the kingdom of God from early on in the narrative of Mark. All throughout we have seen, okay, how he makes that programmatic proclamation that I have come here to inaugurate the kingdom of God. So all throughout he has been announcing the coming of God's kingdom early on. And now towards the end of that narrative of the Gospel of Mark, the only one being called king is actually only Jesus. Though we have Herod, who is called king earlier in chapter 6, we have seen Mark calls him king, though in reality he is not a king. He is only a tetrarch because it was only 1/4 of the territory of Herod the Great that was given to him. So he was a tetrarch, a sort of, a little lesser than the governor, not at all a king. And he is a rotten and a corrupt figure. We have seen how he has treated John the Baptist and was instrumental in putting him to death. But here we have Jesus, who is being called the King of the Jews, a title which is going to be fixed on the cross in the form of the titulus. We have seen on the cross that plaque that was put on that. That was the official charge, okay, under Roman law for which he would stand to be crucified. So the titulus also, what would it state? Jesus, the King of the Jews. So here in reality, he is a true king, wearing a crown of thorns in his death. A very different kind of king than what is being reported to Pilate as claiming to be. And one that Pilate finally will envision when he asks him that question later on. We'll see that is the realization that Pilate comes to. Mark does not tell us, but John's Gospel definitely tells us that my kingdom is not of this world. It's a different kind of kingdom. And Pilate is able to connect the dots and understand what exactly Jesus is driving at. Okay, so he can see through the facade of all this, web of lies that the chief priest and their cronies have, woven in order to trap Jesus. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer?" See how many charges they bring against you, because the accusations must have been flying, okay, to and fro. But Jesus made no further reply. So that Pilate was amazed. And what was Pilate amazed at? He was amazed at his silence. Despite, this rebel pressing against him, they must have been, showing all signs of turning quite violent because they were losing their patience, because Pilate was not willing to, do the bidding of the chief priest and his crowd. So here they are pressing against him, and despite all this clamor that is going around Jesus, Jesus maintains a majestic silence. And Pilate is closely observing Jesus and truly is amazed that he does not respond to their charges. And we have seen why Jesus doesn't respond to their charges, and we'll see here. Why does Jesus allow the false accusations go unanswered? They're making all sorts of accusations, probably the same volley of accusation they had made earlier in the high priestess mentioned. But Jesus refuses to respond to them. Jesus stays silent in the midst of the volley of accusations flying around him thick and fast because of one very important fact, and that is he is obedient to the will of his Father. The cross is why he came. So this silence amazes Pilate, as Mark tells us. And we know this has started right from the right on from Gethsemane, how Jesus has grappled and struggled to come to terms with the mission which is going to be finally culminated. And he bends his head bowing to the will of God. And that is the reason Jesus just remains silent, because there's no point countering their accusations, because they are hell-bent on driving him to the cross, which he can very plainly see. Now Pilate deals with the crowds mobilized by the chief priest. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. Which insurrection, we do not know. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priest had handed him over. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them again, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And so it was growing into a clamor. And that probably might have made Pilate nervous, because finally the main job of the governor was to maintain peace and order. And Rome would look down very severely on a governor who failed to deliver on this. The Barabbas situation. Now, let us analyze that piece of the gospel. The name Barabbas and his character. When we look at the book of Acts chapter 3, verse 14 forwards, Peter, denounces the Jewish authorities, but this is post the resurrection. And what does he say? "You asked Pilate for a murderer to be granted to you, and you killed the Prince of Life." Peter, after the post-resurrection speech, this is the speech that he makes, making a direct accusation before the Sanhedrin when he is hauled over there. So this gives us, a deep insight into what exactly Barabbas was, and the contrast is very striking between Jesus and Barabbas. In the name Barabbas, Mark, we already know. We have seen in that episode and that incident of Bartimaeus, we have seen that Mark, being from Jerusalem, he knows very well Aramaic and Greek as well. He's comfortable and at home with both the languages. He has already given clues to us in the episode of Bartimaeus. The meaning of Bar in Aramaic means son. So Bartimaeus means the son of Timaeus. So here, when we look at the word Barabbas, it would automatically mean son of Abba. Mark doesn't make up this Aramaic name, not at all. It's not that, for literary dramatization of the whole passion narrative. He's trying to introduce this character. Not at all. We know that historically this man was offered as an option against the release of Jesus. So he's definitely not making up this Aramaic name of Barabbas. He was the son of somebody probably called, Abba. He knows there is no substance in the charge they bring against Jesus. So here, this name, Barabbas, it actually means that this man is the son of Abba. I think I had missed out something over here, one important point, and that point is that there is a play on this word. When we look at this, when we look at this word Barabbas, in reality, Barabbas is standing there as an option against Jesus. But in truth, who is really the son of the Father? It is Jesus himself who is the true Barabbas. He is not Barabbas himself, and yet the people choose him. Okay, so Mark is definitely not making up this Aramaic name. Okay, he was the son of somebody called Abba, and that is why he is mentioning this character. He's bringing the passionate narrative. We read from Philo and Josephus that he did not get along with the local aristocracy. Who is that? Pilate. He was a sort of a bully, but they knew how to make him back down. And we know from history that he eventually lost his position in 36 AD to their machinations. Pilate probably had inherited the custom of showing clemency by releasing a prisoner on Passover from past governors, just as the episode in the Bible tells us, that this was common practice, for him to release a person showing clemency on Passover. But it was not something that he might have introduced. It was something that was introduced by the past governors. So he wants to use this diplomatic ploy to save Jesus, but at the same time not inviting the ire of the chief priests and their crowd, believing he may after all be able to outwit them. So he lets the crowds decide. But probably Pilate must have thought that Jesus was popular with the masses, and so taking the issue to the crowds could secure Jesus' release, which was a gross miscalculation on his part. The move backfires to his bewilderment. This was, probably the reasoning that was going on in Pilate's mind. And so the move backfires, and something that he had not expected, because he had underestimated the murderous envy of the mafia chief priest. And John 18, in fact, it is not Mark, because Mark is very matter of fact in narrating the events of the Passion. But if we want to see what was the reasoning that was going on in the mind of Pilate, it is John chapter 18 that gives us a peep into that window into his mind. So John 18 may give us some of Pilate's reasoning, which Mark doesn't. So you are king then. My kingdom is not of this world. We know finally what in the Gospel of John, Pilate takes him aside. He's very afraid when he comes to know, Jesus telling him about the truth. So when he is examining him deeper, interrogating him, he asks him, so you're king then? And Jesus tells him, my kingdom is not of this world. Had it been of this world, my people would have come and fought for me. My kingdom is about truth. So Pilate knew about the cynics in the Gentile world. This is very strange, because Pilate was a Gentile governor. So he was a person who was directly appointed by Rome. So Judea was not the only province probably that he might have governed. Probably he might have been posted as a military officer of a lower rank in the other provinces. So definitely Pilate, being a Gentile, he had come across many of the cynics. Now these cynics who were considered, they were supposed to be philosophers, Greek philosophers, and they were people who practiced a lot of austerity in their dealings and all. They were sort of people who were, very much for truth, for goodness of life. So the higher principles they valued and treasured. So whenever there were cynics around, sometimes cynics and all were very vocal in criticizing the rulers, their local rulers. But most of the time cynics, they would only clash sometimes with the rulers if they did not agree with their policies. Like, for example, they say there was one particular cynic who, clashed very much with Nero when he wanted to, refurbish the baths there in Rome. So he was given a sort of a flogging, but he was let free. They were not considered to be, very harmful to the rulers. So Pilate knew about the cynics in the Gentile world who often clashed with rulers but were wandering, harmless philosophers and must have considered Jesus as one such apolitical sage. So, to Pilate's mind, when we look at the Gospel of John in chapter 18, probably this was the estimation that Pilate, on close examination of Jesus talking to him, this was what he had derived, that this is a harmless man. At the most, he could have labeled him like a sage, like how we, holy men, like we call it today. So for him, he was more like a sage because he talked about the otherworldly things and definitely apolitical. Apolitical means not taking any political side. So basically, he was harmless, and Pilate could see through all the devious plans of the chief priests that they had a hidden agenda to do Jesus to death. So Pilate knows deep in his heart that this man cannot do anything, he cannot hurt anybody. So just let him go. Jesus isn't worth a political backlash. These are the thoughts probably that, are coming across to Pilate's mind. So he offers the crowd the chance to decide, confident that they will choose Jesus to be set free, because when Pilate was, maybe, some of the people around told him that you use this to set one of the prisoners free. So he must have done some sort of, little bit of interrogation about the past of Jesus and had definitely come to know that Jesus was a man who enjoyed a lot of popularity with the people. So probably he felt that if he threw the decision to the crowds to decide, they probably would choose Jesus to be set free. But the chief priests suggest Barabbas and they instigate the crowd to clamor for Barabbas' release. Actually, Barabbas is a real threat. If you go to see, if you compare Jesus to Barabbas, Jesus is not at all a threat to the Roman authorities, and Pilate can plainly see that. On the contrary, Barabbas has been called a lestes, okay? And lestes sometimes could also be people who, engaged in revolutionary acts against the Roman authorities, against Rome. And that any sort of revolution was considered to be high treason uh, that would result in death of the person. So Barabbas actually, when you compare him to Jesus standing there before the crowd, he is a true threat to the Roman law and order, to Rome's peace. It's not Jesus who's a threat, and yet the people are clamoring for Barabbas only at the instigation of the chief priest. In the end, however, Pilate's attempts are defeated and he lets the revolutionary go because the chief priest proved politically smarter and they outmaneuver him. Pilate thought, Pilate had a very uncomfortable relation with the local aristocrats over there. He was, I will be taking the next slides, how, most of the time the chief priest and all the Sanhedrin and all the people who mattered, the Jewish priesthood of Jerusalem, they most of the time would be up in arms against Pilate. Though the Sanhedrin, especially the chief priest, okay, at the head of the Sanhedrin, he had to collaborate with the Roman governor in order to carry out the administration, because Judea was a direct province of the emperor. Okay, so they were not the true rulers. The governor on behalf of the emperor would be ruling the province. So here Pilate, he's using everything within his means in order to outwit them, but they proved to be politically smarter and they outmaneuver him. And since he has already committed himself to the crowds, so he ends up handing Jesus over. Thus, we can safely conclude that Pilate was convinced about the innocence of Jesus, but unfortunately lacked the moral courage to stand up against a devious cloud of chief priests given his political circumstances. We will see what those political circumstances were and why Pilate was so afraid of them. But in the final reckoning, however, we have to see that it was all a part of God's plan of redemption for humanity, for which his beloved Son would pay the ultimate and full price. So we can conclude that Pilate was, forced into taking this decision of handing over Jesus to the crowds. Now let us take a small historical update on Pontius Pilate, and we need to do it in order to fathom, to understand what were the things that dictated the decision that Pilate finally took of handing over Jesus. He could have very well stood up for Jesus, but he did not do that. And that is the reason most of the time we will fault Pilate. And since ancient times, Pilate has always had, very different appraisals or evaluation. Even during ancient times, he was partly looked upon as a saint, partly like a villain. So till today, that historical debate keeps going on. But in order to arrive at a better decision, it's good for us to look into the nature of this man, okay, his character, and what were the compelling political circumstances that forced him to take such a decision. For that, we just need to go a little back in time to look at the administration of Rome's provinces. We know that Rome at this point of time was like a superpower. There was nothing like Rome. The empire of Rome was the in thing. Rome was, such a small little place, but actually conquered almost the known world at that time. And the Roman Empire was normally thought of as, the eastern part of the empire and the western part of the empire. Though they were headquartered in the western part, the eastern provinces like Syria, Egypt, they were their leading provinces. Beside there, the smaller one, Judea, Arabia, they were smaller ones, but they were rich provinces because they fetched a lot of revenue that kept, the economy of Rome going on. So they were they were like prized possessions, the eastern provinces. So administration of Rome's provinces, how it was done, because finally we have to remember Pilate was governor, okay, governor of the Roman province of Judea. So in Pilate's time, the formal title of the provincial Roman governor was Praefectus, in Greek called also Eparchus. And this was a military title, often like, in the gospel account, sometimes he is called governor, sometimes he is called procurator, but procurator was considered to be a lower title. Prefect was it was a military title which was given to the governor. As part of governance of a province in the Roman administrative setup, the imperium. Now, what was imperium? The supreme administrative power, the power to take decisions on behalf of Rome, be it on behalf of the emperor or be it on behalf of the Senate, involving command in war, like when, a province can declare war on another one, and the interpretation and application of the law of the land, including imposing also the death penalty, which actually belonged to Rome, was vested in the provincial governors when ruling their province. So Pilate was a provincial governor vested with the imperium, also including the death penalty to be imposed in Judea. And provinces were of two types in the Roman administrative setup. One was the imperial province that was considered to be more superior and under the direct control of the emperor, as was Judea. Judea was an imperial province, and so he was directly answerable to the emperor. And the second category of provinces were the senatorial provinces, which were under the control and command of the Roman Senate. So the lower ones, okay, were given to the Senate. So they were the ones who had to take stock of what was happening in the senatorial provinces. So we see how Pilate, okay, being the governor of an imperial province, he was directly answerable to the emperor. And this was the reason Pilate used to be afraid of the local aristocrats there in Judea, because they would all the time, in fact, most of the time, they would always threaten Pilate that, they would report him directly to the emperor. They had this nasty habit of, taking embassies wherein all the leading people of the land, they would get together and they would appeal to the Pilate. This would have frightened any provincial governor, where the province was an imperial one. So when a province was annexed by Rome, A law would be drawn up laying down the principles, both financial and judicial, by which it would be governed, any province. And most of the provinces, they were brought under military control because they used to be the product of war and annexation. No province would, willingly come forward and say that, we want to accept your suzerainty. That would never happen. So most of the provinces were conquered territories of the Romans. So whenever a province was established, this set of laws would be promulgated, and most of the time it would be done through an act of of Rome, which would be called an edict. And sometimes the new governors, when they entered office, they needed to enact more laws in order to supplement to the existing ones in the province, and that they could do by issuing edicts. So they had that power because the imperium, the supreme administrative power, was vested in the governors. Unfortunately, we have no copy of the law or edict for the establishment of the province of Judea in 680, but Judea was made a province, a direct province of Rome, only in 680, because when Herod died in 4 BC, one of his sons, Archelaus, he was made a ruler of Judea, but he proved out to be a very nasty ruler, and that is why again Jewish people, they all got together into an embassy and they appealed to Augustus, and that is the reason in 680 Judea was taken over by Augustus. He happened to be the emperor at that point of time, and it was made into an imperial province. So before the time of Emperor Augustus, when Rome was a republic, the Senate would allocate the provinces to various governors. But once Rome became an empire, when Augustus became the first emperor, he took over these powers of the Senate. Okay. Besides, Judea being an imperial province and not a senatorial province, was under direct control of the emperor. So it's very surprising that among all the provinces, the eastern provinces, Judea was the smallest of all, but the most troublesome one for the Romans because of the Jewish people. In excavations at Caesarea on the Palestinian coast, now Caesarea Maritima, this was along the coast, okay, the Palestinian coast. This used to be the headquarters of the Roman governor. So Pilate, being the governor of Judea, he happily, liked to be here in this place, not so much in Jerusalem. He was forced to come to Jerusalem only during the time of the feast, because that would be the time people would converge from all over. So law and order would always be a problem at that point of time. So in excavations, where excavations were carried out in the year 1961, this particular Pilate inscription was discovered, wherein his name is mentioned, Pilatus Pilate, and that's how we know from this inscription it's broken, only part of it has survived, and the inscription tells us, Pontius Pilatus, that is Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. That's how we know that his actual title was prefectus. He was a prefect of Judea. We can also call him the governor. So this inscription dated around 31 AD. This is an inscription around 31 AD, a year probably after Jesus died, pertains to the erection and dedication of a building, a Tiberium, in honor of Tiberius. Caesarea Maritima was a place he always felt very much at home. So here, being the governor, it was up to him to carry out all rebuilding and building projects. So here any governor always wanted to do things in order to, project his loyalty to the existing emperor. So Tiberius, being the emperor at that point of time, he had built up a big building which was called a Tiberium, because it was in his name, in honor of Tiberius. And this building probably must have, served civic and religious purposes, because whenever Roman buildings were put up, most of the time there would be a temple inside, there would be a sort of a, like how the Roman Forum used to be. So all the civic activities and all would be centered on this civic building. So the inscription was later reused in the construction of a theater. Maybe it failed They say probably there was an earthquake due to which, it fell and it was broken into two pieces, and accidentally it was discovered when some renovation work was going on. This was used as a part of, the steps that were built for the theatre. And the left side of the inscription is lost. What remains is a little over 2 feet long, that is 68 centimeters by 82 centimeters. This is what it is. And the inscription clearly tells us that Pontius Pilate was a prefect of Judea. Another very important factor regarding this inscription is many of the scholars, biblical scholars, who are not, so much religious, but more having a bent towards atheism and all, and those who take too much of history into consideration, they used to cast aspersion that Pilate was not at all a historical figure. So much so that even Jesus is, denounced as not being a historical figure, and all the Gospels and all have created a fictionalized account of a person. But today we know this is all very untrue, because archaeological excavations, whatever artifacts and all are being discovered, even now, somewhere or the other, something or the other keeps cropping up. All their claims have been invalidated, and we know that Pilate truly was a historical figure. Estimations of Pilate, favorable and unfavorable. I don't know if you have ever come across the historical detail that Pilate is, revered as a saint along with his wife in the Coptic church and also in the Ethiopian church. There's one particular day, in the calendar which is assigned to him, and he's held in high reverence along with his wife in the Coptic church. So in antiquity, that is in ancient times, there were diametrically opposite views of Pilate. For some he was a saint, for some he was a sinner. So although Mark's portrait of him is not very flattering, Mark's style of writing is very matter of fact. It is like, he just goes from one to another. When we look also at the Passion narrative, there are so many key details we will not find in the Gospel of Mark. They are all, sort of fleshed out and filled in by other portraits that we get mostly from the Gospel of John. So Mark's portrait of him is not a very flattering one. Yet, even in the Gospel of Mark, Pilate comes across like as if he knows that Jesus was handed over because of the jealous envy of the Jewish authorities. This was absolutely clear to him. Yet he does little to help him. So Mark, doesn't, like give us a flattering portrait. It doesn't look like, he's trying to paint Pilate in a positive light. But the other three evangelists portray a nobler Pilate, a more noble figure, seeking to deliver Jesus from exaggerated and even false charges. And this is very clearly, manifested in all the rest of the three gospel accounts besides the Gospel of Mark. And to his eternal memory, however, Pilate is the only Roman governor whose name is evoked in the Creed of Faith. There were so many Roman governors in Judea and elsewhere. But this is one man who is always remembered because we utter his name every time we recite our Creed of Faith. Remember, there's one phrase there, suffered under Pontius Pilate. So to his eternal memory, his name is always remembered when millions of Catholics recite the I believe. Now, why would Pilate be afraid of the Jewish authorities? The entire reason for sharing this historical input about Pilate is to come to this pivotal reason. Okay, Pilate knew very well, he was convinced about the innocence of Jesus. Yet, why did he not stand up for him? He had all the powers. He was a powerful man. Being the governor of Judea was a very powerful position. And given the fact that it was a direct imperial province under the direct rule of the emperor. Yet, we know, when Pilate going back and forth, we find this going back and forth more in the Gospel of John. But here also we get a fairly good portrait of how Pilate is desperately, in fact, trying to, come to Jesus' help in order to see that finally he is set free, but it doesn't happen. Now, to look into the power dynamics between Pilate and the Jewish authorities, let us look into only one example of this power display. That is the incident of the golden shields. Date we do not know, it's uncertain, but definitely it was after the death of Jesus. Okay, probably around AD 31, they say. Jesus, if we maintain that he died in 30, this is an incident post his death. The infamous incident of the golden shields. And there is another one which I have not put out on the slide, but I would like to explain that also about the construction of the aqueduct. Now, coming to first to the golden shields. Now, this was an incident that took place in the year 31. And how we come to know about this? This has been reported by Philo of Alexandria in his word Ad Gaium. Okay, Gaium means it is based on the name of Emperor Caligula. His name was Gaius Caligula. So this was, Ad Gaium means an appeal to Gaius Caesar. This was a work of Philo of Alexandria, who was a very leading Jewish philosopher based in Alexandria in Egypt, but having a lot of pull there in Jerusalem because they came from a very powerful family. His brother was in fact considered to be the ethnarch, means the ruler and the leader of the Jewish community in Alexandria, which was a very powerful community at that point of time. So Philo's brother, given the fact that he was an ethnarch, he was a man who moved about in very high and very powerful political circles. So his work is the one that paints Pilate in the blackest of colors. Okay, could perhaps give us a peek into the dynamics of power between the prefect and the Jewish authorities. It was a very uncomfortable relationship. He did not enjoy a good rapport with them at all. And intensely it appears when we read through all the annals of, Pilate's work as governor, we get the feeling that he did not really like the Jewish people at all. So definitely the authorities also would be viewed in the same light. And the which also, when we talk about the Jewish authorities here, it also includes the Herodian princes. Now, who are the Herodian princes? All the progeny of Herod the Great, his sons, like Herod Antipas, Herod Philip, because we know Herod had lots of children. Okay, so these were the men, the princes, like Herod Antipas was one of them. Pilate had dedicated shields coated with gold in the Herodian palace in Jerusalem. He did this, we are told by Philo in that work of his Ad Gaium, to anger the multitude, like as if he deliberately did this. He brought the shields coated in gold in the Herodian palace in Jerusalem, not on the Temple Mount, but in Herod's palace, which was quite far away from the Temple Mount. But this was considered to be, hurting Jewish sensibilities for the simple reason that Jerusalem was considered to be a holy city. So nothing, related to any pagan cult and all could be brought into the city. It would defile. Okay, so this was the reason. So Philo tells us that he purposely did it to anger the multitude. Yet, in the same this, Philo admits that the shields did not have imagery or other details forbidden by biblical law. Okay, we know that under biblical law, graven images, that is why anything, okay, be it pictures of humans, animals, and all, were totally forbidden. So nothing of that sort was there on these shields which were introduced in the palace, not also in the temple, except that they named the person honored and the one who had made the dedication, that is Pilate himself, his name was there, and the name of the person, obviously Tiberius's name was there. In response to Pilate's action, a protest about the infringement of Jewish tradition was made to Pilate by a multitude, headed by whom? 4 Herodian princes. And who were the princes? They were likely Herod Antipas, Philip of Iturea, his brother, and Herod Philip, father of Salome and ex-husband of Herodias. Does this ring a bell in your mind? Herod Philip? He was the husband of Herodias, who left her husband and got married to Herod Antipas. So look at them. Okay, Herod Antipas has stolen Herod Philip's wife, but they are all together here in order to oppose Pilate. And so this entire protest against what Pilate had done by simply bringing the shields in the Herodian palace, this was, like they made a big deal out of it, and they brought tremendous pressure on Pilate. And all this is being told to us today by whom? Well, by Philo of Alexandria in his work. So he continues, when Pilate resisted, they came to Pilate, he says, and they told him to take away the shields from the Herodian palace. They, hurt our sensibilities. It is in direct violation of biblical law. So when they tried to, bear upon Pilate, that, he might remove the shields from there, Pilate was not in favor of it. He resisted. So they warned him that he was provoking an uprising and even war. And how did they threaten him? These were the words: do not take Tiberius, Emperor Tiberius, as your pretext for outraging the nation. He does not wish any of our customs to be overthrown. Why they are quoting Tiberius? Because Tiberius's name was there, because they were in honor of him. So don't take the pretext of Tiberius in order to, humiliate our nation. He does not wish any of our customs to be overthrown. He, that is Philo, goes on to state that Pilate became afraid that they may send an embassy to the emperor against him, because this was normally what they would do, the Jews, as they threatened. And when they did so, they did send an embassy to the emperor complaining against Pilate's installation of the golden shields in the palace. Philo tells us that the emperor rebuked Pilate, scolded him, and ordered him to take the shields from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Take it to your headquarters, not there. Now, this account by Philo is quoted as contents of a letter by Agrippa I to the Emperor Caligula. When he is writing, Philo is writing this work of his Ad Gaium. He happened to write this much after Caligula died. This was all in the backdrop of Caligula. You remember, he had made that big direct threat. He had summoned the people, and he had ordered the Jerusalem priesthood that you are going to put up a big, huge, life-size statue of me in the Jerusalem temple, because he wanted to convert the temple into a shrine of imperial cult. So in the backdrop of all this, okay, all these things about how Pilate was treated by Tiberius is being quoted in a so-called letter by Agrippa I to the Emperor Caligula. So if you look at this work at Gaium, there are two addresses. One is directly he is addressing to Caligula, but at the time when he was finalizing and completing his work in 41 AD, Caligula was already dead. So here who comes, the next emperor on the scene is Emperor Claudius. And so the second address is making to Emperor Claudius. But there is a very strange take on the whole thing. When scholars look at this work, they know that Philo's account of Pilate cannot be trusted. Why? Because the entire reason and the goal behind writing this work, okay, was to appeal to Claudius in order to see that the office of the procurator or the prefect of Judea is abolished and Agrippa I is made a king in place of them. And sadly, they do succeed, because Claudius, Emperor Claudius, who became actually an emperor by fluke in the year in the year 41 AD, he became the emperor, and he was a very close friend of Agrippa I, and that's how Claudius agreed to make Agrippa the king. But Agrippa happened to remain king just for 4 years. Okay, so Philo had to be very careful in criticizing Emperor Tiberius for anti-Jewish actions. If he had anything to complain, they should have complained against Tiberius, because his name was there on those standards which were brought in that Herodian palace. But they couldn't take a direct dig at him, and that is why they pushed the entire blame on Pilate. Philo's account is considered untrustworthy by many scholars, given the fact that he was trying to promote the appointment of Agrippa I as king in place of a procurator or prefect for Judea. And that is why he is quoting this incident which has already occurred a few years ago, just in order to show, in order to impress upon Emperor Claudius that you take the same action that Tiberius had taken, not what Caligula is doing. But in order to impress that upon the Emperor Claudius, they are simply trying to make Pilate scapegoat, because he's not there to defend himself. Okay, so given the fact that he was trying to promote the appointment of Agrippa I as king, okay, which they finally succeeded, he may have scapegoated Pilate to achieve his goal. So something to think about this whole incident, because if we have too much of negative portrayal of Pilate in his governorship, most of it all comes from the works of Philo and from that work of his ad Gaium. Okay, he paints Pontius Pilate in a very bad light. If historically Tiberius was really so angry with Pilate as Philo Agrippa claimed, why did he not remove the prefect in the first place? Because Tiberius was known for this type of severity. He wouldn't have just simply scolded him, and let him go scot free. He definitely would have dismissed him from his post and, asked him to report back to Rome as was finally done. Okay, sadly, it was finally what Pilate always feared that happened in the year 36 AD. So Philo's ad Gaium is the most hostile to Pilate. So Pilate had to be mindful of political realities as he did in other matters of governance. So every time Pilate, whatever he wanted to do, any administrative decisions he wanted to, this people, especially the Jerusalem priesthood, because they were the ones who also wielded some sort of secular power in collaboration with Pilate. They were his biggest impediment and opposed. More importantly, another incident was about the aqueduct. Now, Pontius Pilate, being a right thinking governor, municipal administration of Jerusalem definitely was under his control. Of course, in collaboration with the local rulers, that is the Jewish priesthood. So, Pilate, in one particular incident, he took the money from the temple treasury. There was something called the Kurban, you remember? People used to deposit lands and also this was a huge expanded treasury that was there. And this Kurban was supposed to be meant, okay, for public works and for people's welfare. So Pilate, without any hesitation, of course, he must have taken the Sanhedrin into consultation, but they must have opposed him. But regardless of that, he used the money from that Korban collection in order to build that aqueduct to bring in water into Jerusalem. So what bad was that? Any governor would have been, praised for such a move because he has thought about the welfare of the entire city, but not this entire incident was taken in a very bad light and protest followed. There was a huge protest. People came and when he was in Jerusalem, probably at a feast, they surrounded, okay, his palace, and the siege went on for quite some days. Finally, Pilate gave the order. He told his soldiers to go in plain clothes without the soldiers' cloaks, and mingle with the crowd with direct orders not to use swords against them. They were asked to carry some small cudgels and all, and who were the key people who were inciting the mobs to use it against them. But unfortunately, the whole thing went out of control. The Roman soldiers they became very violent, and this resulted in a huge number of deaths for which Pilate was held responsible. Of course, the problem of Pilate was he grossly underestimated the repressive tendencies of his soldiers, and that is the reason. This must have been one, several others, because even Josephus, when he writes about Pilate later on, he always talks about, Pilate was a person, governor, who was given into a lot of bribes, okay? He was very harsh. He would carry out executions without trial. Part of the things, of course, what he did was not always very right, but he wasn't as bad a governor as he was made out to be by the Jewish writers. I put out this slide for you. You can see for yourself, okay? This is Philo of Alexandria, Philo Judaeus, and this is Josephus, whom we are very familiar with. Josephus was born in 37 and died around 100. So just around 7 years after Jesus' death, he comes on the scene. So definitely whatever Josephus writes about Pilate, okay, at that point of time, 36 AD, Pilate was already dismissed from his post and he was summoned to Jerusalem. Josephus was just born the next year. So definitely these are not eyewitness accounts by Josephus. And the same way with Philo, we know for what reasons he tries to paint Pilate in black colors. So Philo was more or less like a contemporary, we can say, of Jesus, but much older. He was born in 20 BC and supposed to have died in 50 AD. It also, this chart is very nice because it gives you also the rulers, Herod the Great. Then in red, we have the emperors. So Jesus was born at the time when Augustus was emperor, died when Tiberius was emperor. Okay, and here we have Caligula's very short reign of just 4 years, and then we have later, after him comes Claudius. These are the works of Philo of Alexandria. Now, this Pilate's stone presents Pontius Pilate, of course, we know as a prefect of Judea. So, he was not merely a procurator, which is a lower title. And many a times, when this Pilate inscription is also cited as a support that Tiberius, okay, Pilate was very loyal to Tiberius, because this was an inscription that was marked, okay, for the building of the Tiberium in Caesarea. So he was a proponent of the Roman imperial cult in Judea. Since he had put up in the Tiberium, there definitely must have been a temple to Caesar where the imperial cult was practiced. So many a time, many of the scholars, they feel that this inscription is also proof that Pontius Pilate, he wanted to bring about maybe the Roman imperial cult in Judea, probably in Jerusalem, but this may not completely be true, because this could have also been an act only to impress the emperor. It may also demonstrate the governor's personal reverence for the emperor, putting in a new light the words shouted at Pilate during Jesus' trial, what is quoted in John. If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. This was a pressure that was brought to bear upon Pilate by the Jewish authorities. This was this is the excavated site at Caesarea. This was a praetorium. Praetorium was the palace of the governor. So here in Caesarea Maritima, this was a place that he preferred always to be. He would come to Jerusalem only during the feast of the Jewish people. So here they have found the remains of the praetorium, okay, the Roman administrative center of the governor. And this was the administrative headquarters also. Built under Herod the Great and named in honor of Emperor Augustus, this coastal Mediterranean city boasted splendid architecture, including this particular praetorium, the governor's palace, and the Tiberium, the entire building which Pilate built in honor of Tiberius later on. Another thing that was cited against Pilate, okay, as proof that, he was trying to promote the imperial cult in the Temple of Jerusalem and maybe in entire Judea, was about the coins that he minted. Now we have to remember that these coins, okay, these particular coins, these have been found in excavated sites, okay. Here, these were pagan symbols that were inscribed on the coins, and this was something that was, very hurting to the Jewish sensibilities. So pagan symbols, they always, they claimed that Pilate deliberately, purposely to hurt their sentiments, he used, pagan cultic symbols on his coinage, okay. So here we have the Latin litus, okay, and ladle, simpulum. This ladle, the simpulum, was supposed to be, a sort of a spoon that is used to draw out libations during cultic practices in the temple. And this litus is more like, sort of a stirrer. So these were pagan cultic symbols that were engraved on the coins. And these were used in Judea by the people because this was the currency of the. So they say he deliberately did this. But this is very strange, because prior to Pilate, the governor who was there, okay, Gratus, he also had used similar symbols, but nobody complained. So the Greek inscription on the obverse side of the coin pictured here, okay, reads of Tiberius Caesar. And they used to, put also the date. Only this used to be left blank on the mold, and when that particular time is to be there to come out with the coinage, this date would be filled in. And these coins used to be minted in Jerusalem. But scholars also point out that it was not normal practice to mint these coins in Jerusalem. They used to be minted in Antioch in Syria, because this currency used to be, uniform for the entire Syrian Judean province. So these small bronze coins, they were made of bronze. They bear witness to Pilate's dedication to promoting Roman religion to Judea. This is cited as one of the proofs that he wanted to do it, but it's not very convincing. Now, when we look at the biographical facts about Pontius Pilate, let us see what they were. He was of equestrian rank, that is, of lower Roman nobility, as contrasted with senatorial rank, higher nobility. In Rome, these people were very class conscious. Those who were in the Senate, most of the time, they were, from the patrician families, so-called patrician families. They were the highest of the nobility. So they were considered to be senatorial rank, higher, so consuls and all would come from them. But those who were, smaller rank, that was the equestrian rank, they came from the common people, the plebeians, they were called. So Pilate came from the equestrian rank. So these were people who rose from the common people to these higher ranks chiefly on the merit of their performance. Whereas those who, got in this senatorial ranks and were in the higher nobility, they were born to power. Whereas when you belong to the equestrian rank, you had to literally work your way up to higher position. And likely Pilate was of the equestrian rank. So that must have been one factor why he was, a little afraid of the Jewish aristocrats way back there in Judea. He served as a fifth of the seven pre-Agrippa prefects. Agrippa, first grandson of Herod the Great, was made king of Judea, the same one, who was Philo's friend. When Claudius, his friend, became emperor in 41, he also, quickly made him. It's a very interesting story that when Caligula was murdered, Claudius was so scared, he was around there only, and he was hiding under the chair, and Agrippa first happened to be there, in Rome at that point of time, and he is the one, who banged on this. He saw the power vacuum and encouraged Claudius to grab the seat of the emperor, and that's how Agrippa first was rewarded. But unfortunately, we know that Agrippa remained as the ruler of Judea only for 4 years. He died in the year 44 AD, shortly within 4 years, an event which is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles because he was extremely hostile to our early Christians. He was the same man who had put Peter and John in the prison, remember, when they were persecuted? So it was Agrippa the first. So prior to Agrippa, all the prefects who were there in Judea, there were 7 of them, including Pontius Pilate. And after Agrippa died in 44 AD, again Judea became a direct province of Rome. So from 6 AD to 66 AD, we know when the Jewish revolt broke out. Till that time, except for that interim period of 4 years, the Romans were the ones who considered Judea to be their direct province. Among all of them, of all those prefects altogether, 14 prefects were there. Pilate is the best remembered, and he was the fifth among the 7 pre-Agrippa prefects. He is the best known prefect because of the number of references to him in the works of Josephus and Philo. Amongst the total of 14 prefects in the years era AD 6 to 66, Pilate, who ruled for 10 years, 26 to 36 AD, when he was finally recalled to Rome, was the second longest serving prefect after his predecessor, Valerius Gratus, who served 11 years. So Gratus served for 11 years, Pilate just 1 year less. More or less, it might be more than 10 years, because when Pilate was removed, we are not very sure whether it was 36 AD December or maybe in around maybe in January, but definitely before February, because we know that Tiberius, who recalled him to Rome, he dismissed him from his seat. The Syrian legate Vitellius, he removed him, and he was summoned. By the time he reached Rome, Tiberius was already dead. I think it was on the 17th of March 37 AD. When he reached there, Tiberius was already gone. 3 legates ruled in Syria during Pilate's term in Judea, but he remained there for 10 years. It is very interesting and very noteworthy that in his decade-long prefecture, the 10 years that he ruled Judea, Pilate never removed a Jewish high priest. Very surprising fact. Caiaphas had that religious role from 18 AD to 37, much before Pilate came on the scene. Caiaphas was already high priest, and in fact, the highest, longest serving high priest was Caiaphas for 19 years. Finally removed by Vitellius, the legate of Syria, just after Pilate's own removal in December 36 AD. And why was Pilate removed in 36 AD? Unfortunately, the thing that he feared the most always, remember how when Jesus also was brought in, that is what they were always trying to bear upon him, that you are no friend of Caesar, because he was afraid these people would get together, take an embassy to the emperor and complain against him. And this is exactly finally what happened to Pilate, because in the year 36 AD, suddenly there was a Samaritan prophet who rose on the horizon. And the Samaritan prophet, now Samaritans had, always were hostile to the Jews. Yet the Samaritan prophet, he told all the Samaritans, for the Samaritans, the Mount Gerizim was considered to be very sacred. We'll see in the Gospel of John later. And that when he has a discourse with a Samaritan woman, what was the main point of contention between the two of them? They did not accept the sanctity of Jerusalem, the Samaritans. They considered Mount Gerizim to be the sacred place, not Jerusalem. And that is why this Samaritan prophet, when he came, he told all the people something very strange. He said, you all come there, assemble at the foot of Mount Gerizim, and I will take you to the top of the mountain and show you where Moses had buried all the treasures, the vessels, okay, the sacred vessels. And people believed him. And when Pilate was alerted about this, because Samaria also came under Judea, when Pilate was alerted, this was going to be a big riot, sort of a law and order situation. So immediately, Pilate, being the governor of the land, he deployed his troops with the instructions to block them from going up to the mountain. And these, unfortunately, the Samaritans had come with arms. And so when the cavalry and the infantry troops of the Roman legions were there, the cohort or whatever, Pilate gave the order, okay, in order to bring them under control, and there was a bloodbath that followed. Many of the Samaritans they were killed there, and because of this incident of so-called brutality by Pilate, an embassy of the Samaritans, they went to Tiberias and they complained against Pilate, and that is the reason Pilate was summoned. He was dismissed. The legate of Syria, who was the neighbor, he was of a higher standing. The legate of Syria was always superior to the prefect of Judea. So he ordered him, removed Pilate, okay, in 36 AD December, and then Pilate had to go to Rome. And within a few months, Caiaphas also was removed by March of 36 AD. And they say that many scholars, make a guess that probably Pilate was, sort of instigated by Caiaphas who need to take the army and strike against the Samaritans, because the Samaritans and the Jews were always at loggerheads. Because what other reason was there for Caiaphas' removal? Because Caiaphas also was removed in March 37. So such stability was quite unusual given the following facts. 4 high priests were deposed during his predecessor's time, but Pilate did not depose a single high priest. Caiaphas continued to be the high priest when Pilate appeared in Judea and exited the Judean scene. So when historians evaluate Pilate's performance as governor, they point to the fact that although after 31 AD, Emperor Tiberius dismissed many who had been appointed by Sejanus. Now this man Sejanus was, a very high-ranking officer, the right-hand man of Emperor Tiberius. And Sejanus was so powerful that he was the one who had appointed Pilate governor of Judea. So when Emperor Tiberius, something happened, Sejanus was, projected as becoming too powerful, and that is the reason Tiberius, connived to see that Sejanus was ultimately put to death. And this happened in 31 AD. And when 31 AD Sejanus was put to death, he was thrown down, a so-called, they had that Domitian stairs where they plunge the person directly to death so that the body flows in the Tiber River. That was the death that was given to Sejanus, and Sejanus was Pilate's patron. So when Tiberius came back in 31 AD and put Sejanus to death, Many others who were appointed by Sejanus were also removed from their office, but not Pilate. Emperor Tiberius, if he suspected the loyalty of Pilate, why would he allow him to remain in office for still another 5 years, which shows that Tiberius considered him loyal. Pilate was appointed prefect by Sejanus, who was his patron, and met a violent end at the orders of Tiberius on 18th October 31 AD. These statistics caution us against prejudging Pilate as ineffective and not a very good governor, because if you try to take a bird's eye view of how the other procurators, the other governors fared against Pilate, Pilate emerges to be a better governor than most of them. Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. So when we take, we'll look at the historical background of Pilate and what were those, peculiar political circumstances of that time, we can understand better the reasoning that was going on in Pilate's mind. And definitely, whoever came in contact with Jesus, a person who was not of the mind of this Jewish high priest and all, people who are different from them, definitely people would be impacted by the presence of Jesus. And I am sure that when Jesus was brought before Pilate, and the back and forth, examinations that he went on having with Jesus, quite some time must have gone into that. Pilate must have got a very unique glimpse into Jesus, which unfortunately the gospel narratives do not tell, but we can guess from John's account of how he is portrayed. Now, when we look at this place where Jesus was brought, the governor's palace, which was called the Praetorium. I showed you the picture of the Praetorium in Caesarea Maritima, where he was based. So in Jerusalem, there was a Praetorium where Jesus was brought before Pilate. When we look at this map, this Jerusalem in the time of Jesus, this was supposed to be Herod's palace, Herod's palace. And somewhere here, this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That is the place of Golgotha, where Jesus was finally crucified. So when we look at, when people go to Jerusalem today, many of our Catholic pilgrims, when they go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and before coming to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it is normal practice for many of them to go via the Via Dolorosa, that is the Way of Sorrows, which starts from this Antonia Tower, that is Antonia Fortress, and culminates here. And so from medieval times, from the Crusader times, the fortress Antonia has always been projected as the place of the Praetorium. But today, archaeology tells us that the fortress Antonia was definitely not the site of the Praetorium where Pilate was residing in Jerusalem when he was there. The place was more likely Herod's palace, which was here. You can see. And the Praetorium, this is the judgment, this is the place, the compound, because when we talk about Herod's palace, it was not just one single palace. It was a complex of many buildings with huge gardens and all around, with a huge compound here. So likely in the compound here, inside, we don't know exactly the location, Pilate must have interrogated Jesus. It must have been here where he was brought. And the place called the Gabbatha, which John gives this name, we find this name only in the Gospel of John, the seat from which Pilate judged, and passed on his final verdict. The throne, the seat is called actually the Bema, and the entire platform of judgment is called the Gabbatha in Hebrew. That was likely somewhere over here, over here. I'll show you the next slide. This is the place of the Praetorium. This is the place where that Gabbatha, that platform where Pilate must have sat on the judgment seat and passed the verdict of handing Jesus over to the Jewish high priest along with their people. So Pontius Pilate, okay, we know that he preferred to stay in Caesarea because that was his headquarters. But when he came to Jerusalem on the Passover of April 30 C, when Jesus died, we know for sure he must have stayed in the complex of Herod's palaces here, okay, somewhere here. Not here in Antonia, because this was more like a fortress, and this was a place where the Roman cohort used to be stationed. An entire legion was not here. It was not required because Jerusalem was a small city. So just a cohort was considered to be 1/10 of the entire legion. And the entire legion comprised of 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. So 1/10 probably would be around 500 to 600 soldiers. But even then, quite a big number, and they would be stationed here because this was the highest point from which they could keep watch over what was happening inside the temple. So obviously, Pilate would not have put up residence over here. So likely he was here, and it was here that the Roman trial took place. The spot is marked in red over here. This is, I forgot to read this up. In the painting below, that is in the next slide, one artist, Balej Balog, did. He puts the palace grounds just inside the wall, this wall, okay, this wall that is there, okay. The palace gardens were here, where Pilate must have examined him. And also shows a gate leading inside the royal grounds. This is the painting that he has done. A very beautiful painting because can you see the this portion, sorry, this portion is considered to be the gate, okay. Backside, behind this is the entire palace, and from here they could come in and out, and this was the seat of judgment. This was that, okay, considered to be the judgment seat of Pilate, from where he was, passing the judgment. People are all over here. These are the steps, and this is the entrance, okay, to the garden from where he's brought out over here for passing the verdict. This is the actual reconstructed model, but more or less this is the place. Can you see? Okay, you have to look at this. This will tell you. You see this thing that you see, this is the outline of this building. This is the artist illustration. He has drawn this, but the actual model that is worked out and is there in Jerusalem is somewhere here. So somewhere over here was the entrance where Jesus was brought out. Shimon Gibson, okay, he is a very famous archaeologist who in the 1970s has carried out great excavations along this entire western wall area of the city. Back in 1970s under Megan Roshi, another very famous archaeologist, and together they have studied this site in great detail and has been able to identify its main features. Of our 4 New Testament Gospels, it is only John who knows the precise topography of the scene. The way this area looks today appears in the photo in the next slide. You can still see the steps intact from Herodian times leading up to the platform where Pilate sat. And the area where the gate led into the Praetorium, the platform was called Gabbatha. In John 19:13 we get this step. So this is the famous place from where, according to John's Gospel, Pilate uttered his very famous words. There are paintings and all to illustrate this, like how Jesus is being handed over to the crowds. And Pilate uttered this famous word, Ecce homo, that is, behold the man. Jesus was then taken down the steps and led to the place of crucifixion outside the city walls, because crucifixion couldn't take place inside the city, just like burials couldn't. So this is the actual, the photo. You can see the outline of the wall here. So it was here somewhere. So this was Pilate's seat, and these are the steps, still are very visible. This is the pavement, a closer Photoshop. Now, one important detail is when people go, as I already pointed out to you, when we go on our pilgrimages to Jerusalem and all, people are often taken to the Fortress Antonia, which is supposed to be, according to traditional dating, that is supposed to be the Praetorium. But not so. That only came to be during Crusader times. Somehow we do not know why it was presumed that, Pilate would be judging Jesus there. The Antonia fortress, however, would have been too small to be the residence and headquarters of the governor. Its main purpose was to serve as a military observation tower. Remember, it was from there all the cohort would keep a watch over the activities in the temple. So today, though pilgrimages that go to the Holy Land, they will still, you'll find tour guides, taking the people over there and tell you in a very emotional manner, we all go via Dolorosa, but that is not actually the site. Today, all scholars have come to a consensus that the Praetorium was Herod's palace on the western side of the city and not the Fortress Antonia. Herod's palace was not a building, it was a compound. And the compound was ideal for Roman governors, okay, as stated by Shimon Gibson, the archaeologist. He's come out with a book at that point of time called In the World of Jesus, and this is the statement he makes, okay. Gibson explains why it's likely the Praetorium was located in Herod's palace. There can be no doubt that on the occasions when Pilate stayed in Jerusalem, particularly during the Jewish festivities, he took up residence at Herod's old palace, situated on the west side of the city, also known as a Praetorium. The word Praetorium might refer to a palace or a judicial military seat. But it is also likely, okay, that in Jerusalem it referred to the entire palace compound, okay, the Herodian compound, which on the north included palatial buildings used for residential purposes and on the south for military barracks. This is another photo of the excavated site. This is one of the palace complexes of Herod that has been excavated by the Tower of David complex. Okay, there is one entire organization called the Tower of David Complex Organization for Excavation. They are the ones who are putting out all these photos. This is another photo. This is the entire, okay, these are all excavated sites of that whole palace, whole complex of Herod's palace. So it was just not one small building. It was a series of buildings with gardens and all in between and huge compounds. Gibson locates the judgment seat of Pilate, as I told you, inside the wall through a gate leading inside the palace. Okay, I'll read this. At the traditional site of the Gabbatha maintained by the Sisters of Zion, okay, these sisters, this congregation, they are the ones who look after that traditional site at Fortress Antonia, is the starting point of the Via Dolorosa, where even today pilgrims are profoundly moved as tour guides narrate how Jesus cursed and mocked in the courtyard of the Antonia, where the stone pavement, today known as Lythostrotus. There is a stone pavement there at Fortress Antonia also, but that is definitely not Gabbatha. However, they have no idea that this is surely the wrong place and that the tradition of the Via Dolorosa only went back to Crusader time. So remember, if you happen to make a journey to Jerusalem, go and really visit the true Praetorium, which is here in Herod's palace. This is put out over here. So probably Jesus was handed down over here, and from here along the side, from here, he was taken here to Golgotha. We know the site of Golgotha is within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has been positively proved as the definite site where he was crucified. So for Christians, okay, Herod's palace might throw up the route taken for centuries to retrace Jesus' steps from his trial to his crucifixion, okay, called the way of the sorrows. But in reality, that is not the way that Jesus must have walked to his death, going to Golgotha to be crucified. Although the path of the Via Dolorosa has long been venerated, Tower of David Museum director Elliot Lieber told the Washington Post newspaper that she hopes Christians will eventually make Herod's Palace complex near Jaffa Gate a standard destination of the Praetorium. So this is the famous utterance of Pilate when he finally tried his level best to save Jesus but could not. He had to cow down and give in to the devious plots of the Jewish aristocrats who had all assembled to see that Jesus was finally put to death. So, behold the man.